welcome in the new episode of Land Down Under the podcast. I'm Hale.
And I'm Jo.
And today we're talking about things Australia.
So we have an amazing guest on the podcast today. And a fun fact, in our second episode, we mentioned that the first time I came to Australia, I stayed with a host family. Well, today's guest is the mum of that host family. It's the myth, the legend, the one and only Jodie. So welcome, Jodie, on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. It's an honour. And it's a nice recognition of the lovely relationship that you and I have had for many years now. And not just you and I, but our whole family. So it's lovely that I've been asked to come and do this. A little bit about myself. I was born in country New South Wales in a very small town and then moved to another very small town and grew up there. And then in my adult life and adult married life, I moved to Brisbane and lived there for some time, and have also spent time on the Gold Coast where we currently live. So quite removed lifestyles in my growing up years to my adult years.
That's good. Ale and I are both very excited about today's episode because you have a lot of knowledge on, well, lots of things, but especially about a topic that we want to learn more about and that we consider crucial to Australian culture. And that's Indigenous knowledge, which said like that sounds very broad and is a very broad topic. Can you tell us more about how you first became involved with Indigenous knowledge and what drew you to learn more about it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. In the little country town in New South Wales where I grew up, there was a big Indigenous population. And a lot of these things I've learnt in hindsight and been able to put context around what I saw as I was growing up and the way we lived in our small country town. So in that, I mean that there were 2 Aboriginal missions on the edge of my town, one on either side of town. And Aboriginal missions are like a public housing effort but also for Indigenous people, it was a way of keeping the Indigenous people out of the town. So they're right on the edge of town, which has lots of issues in itself in that. But I grew up. So all my mates at school, most of them lived in those missions and would, clearly the one closest to my school, kids came from that mission. We never paid any attention to that as kids. It just was our life. They were just our mates. Everybody was mates. There was no distinctions made. Mm-hmm. But that's through my white lens, isn't it? So for the Aboriginal kids there were lots of distinctions between us and them. And in Indigenous knowledge, that now has a name and it's called othering. So the dominant society creates an other because they don't fit. So they keep them on the edges, obviously in that example, physically and politically and emotionally and socially, they're separate. So I didn't know that as a kid. That was my growing up, all my mates. We were all just one big group of mates. When I finished my first university degree, I'd left town for a little while and went back. And I got a job in what was like a Commonwealth Employment Service where people who'd been on social benefits for a long time would register and they'd receive an allowance from the government. Okay. And I worked with some really lovely Aboriginal ladies. I'm reverting back to that terminology because that was that point in time and they were my Aboriginal friends and we were good mates. We'd have drinks after work and for me, there was never really any distinction. Everybody, we were just friends, but clearly, there was a lot more going on. And those ladies could tell me stories about when they were kids being locked up in the missions because by the time I was in that town, only as a young child, there weren't fences around them anymore, but there had been like right up until the early 1970s, fences around those missions so they could be locked up. There were curfews where they would have to return by 6 p.m. at night. The milkman would deliver the milk to the gate because it was still locked, and all the bottles would line up against the gate until it was unlocked and everybody could get out and collect their morning milk delivery. And then in the mornings, I think the gates were open again at about 6 or 7 p.m. 7 a.m., sorry. So they talked about that. They talked about mission life, growing up in the mission. There was poverty, there was illness, there was lack of education, there was not enough food, the houses were inadequate. Within the town, they received a lot of criticism because they appeared to be, they were perceived to have been not appreciating the housing. And it wasn't until later on I realised that the reason that they were ripping up the floorboards in these houses that they'd been provided and were meant to have been forever grateful for they were never consulted about how those houses were built or how they looked or how they were culturally appropriate for them and their larger family groups, because they lived together in extended families usually. And the fact that they were pulling up the floorboards and building fires in the backyard was because there was no heating in them. They were cold. But from the Western gaze looking in, they were seen to be ungrateful and disrespectful, and they were ruining, something that they were lucky to have, that they were lucky to have been given. So that town had a very strong racist history, and a lot more of that made sense to me. I used to travel out to a little community, which was another mission about 120 kilometres out of town, and I used to go there as a part of a recruitment because it was an agricultural area and there would be lots of jobs in the ag industry, and it was casual labour, so that was deemed to be suitable enough for Aboriginal people to perform those tasks. It was like farming things. So I would go out to this other mission town, and that little town was mostly a mission, not so much a town. It was very isolated, had no facilities, a little bit of infrastructure in a little school and a little health centre, but it was still about another 20 kilometres from the nearest town that had a supermarket and things like that. It was really rough living out there. And I used to go there, and I used to drive what was called in the day a Commonwealth car. So the government would provide staff with cars to deliver these services. Okay. And they were always white. They were always a white Holden with a number plate that started with a Z. So they were referred to, yes, everybody knew, exactly. Everybody knew about the Z cars. And we were just all lumped together as being from the government, which for Aboriginal people was a very confronting and scary thing because they had control of their money, essentially, because they were all on benefits. And I used to drive out there, and I was not there anything to do with their money, though. I was just there trying to help them get jobs. Mm-hmm. And I was about 24 and really naive. So I would drive through the community to get to the meeting point. All these people would be coming out of their houses, collecting up the kids. It was like the village just disappeared inside their houses. And I was like, I don't know what's going on here. But anyway, here to do a great job and help and, whatever. So I'd turn up to my meeting point, and first few times I went, I think I used to go about once a week. First few times one person would come out of the school and greet me and sit me up behind my little desk in my little chair, wait for people to come. Nobody would come, and I'd sit there for 2 hours, nobody'd come, but I'd be very patient and wait. This went on for a little while. Eventually more people would come out and greet me, and I started to feel a bit more welcome because I just kept going. I had no idea that maybe I shouldn't have been. I didn't know. I just kept going. Eventually some little kids would come out. What I finally learnt was that because one of the big policies in Australia in the 1940s and 50s was to remove children from their homes, which then became the stolen generation as we know it today, they thought I was coming to take the children. And when I found that out, I was just devastated. It still really affects me because it's just really confronting to realise that that was still such a memory in their minds, and that memory had been passed down through their generations, that you must be wary of the government because they will take your children. And so they were just putting the children away to be safe. Eventually, I didn't realise that until a long time after, but I was just always happy and friendly and open and came with goodwill. And eventually they got that, and eventually people would come out and greet me, and then they would give me lunch, and I ate all manner of very strange things. Bush food, killed, fresh bush food, boiled, between 2 slices of white bread, whatever. I ate it because they had made it for me and I was grateful.
Yeah.
And I was told one day, near to the end of my time doing that job, that unbeknownst to me, I always had someone in that community had been appointed to look after me. There's always like a protector. Once you've been accepted into the community, there is always someone who's appointed from within the community that looks out for you. And there was a man who'd been appointed to look out for me, and I never knew, but I was always safe.
Okay.
Yeah, nice.
Is he the first point of contact you had when you got there?
No, I don't think so. No, because all of that developed. So the first point of contact was just like a teacher's aide from the school or something, like a younger lady. And yes, as time went on, I was allowed kind of access to more significant people in that community who essentially were, well, not essentially, they were the elders of that community, so the designated leaders of that space. Yeah.
How long for did you end up doing that job for?
I did that job for about five years, I think.
Yeah.
Not always going there, but sort of doing other things within it. Yeah, I used to go with my Aboriginal colleagues to other remote places, and there was a funny day when one day we were on this little dirt road out the back of nowhere, and my lovely colleague, she was driving the Z car, and we're going along this back shortcut way, and next minute she hits the brakes and the car comes to a stop, and she jumps out of the car. I'm like, oh my God, what's happened? She runs around the back, opens the boot, gets out like the tyre wrench, runs back over to the bushes, is hitting something in the bushes, and comes back with it wrapped up in a hessian bag, and it was an echidna. And that's good tucker. That's good bush food.
Okay.
And so she had killed the echidna, wrapped it in the hessian bag, thrown it in the back of the boot, and we kept driving. She took it home for dinner.
By the way.
Yeah. Yeah. It was like a real find. She was...
Hold that thought for a minute.
I know. The whole thing took about, 2 minutes. She was so quick. She had to be quick to get it because they run fast, echidnas.
Yeah. Yes, I saw them. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever seen one in the wild or something.
Oh yeah.
Mm.
I just saw one once.
You briefly mentioned earlier the terminology about how saying Aboriginal back then was fine. Could we discuss that on the wording now and what's
Yes.
appropriate to say?
So it's had, so there's been a lot of discussion around this. It creates a lot of discussion in the media and within groups within Australia generally about the correct terminology to call Aboriginal people. So originally back in the early stages of colonisation, and so like into the 1920s, 1930s, once there was clear government policy about how the government was going to deal with this problem, they were called the Aboriginal people were called Aborigines. And that came from a very kind of native type background, very European type background, where Aboriginal people had then been identified as being something else, something that we weren't, that they were a problem, and they were native, as in almost like native animals that live on the land, was kind of, and that they were tribal, and that they needed special consideration because they caused a problem, basically. So they were referred to as Aborigines as a collective group. As time went on, probably around the 70s and 80s, as Aboriginal policy had changed a few times in that time, there'd been eras of activism, and Aboriginal people standing up and saying we won't be treated like this anymore. We're Australia's first citizens. Mm-hmm. We were here before the colonisers, and we don't like that terminology, it's not respectful. And the word then became Aboriginal. And then over time, and in more recent years, through the policy era of self-determination, it then became a more kind of academic term. It became Indigenous. Then it became Indigenous peoples. Some people, it really depends on where you are. I'll give you the last one. The current one is First Nations peoples. So they're all the iterations of that one word. It really depends who you're talking to, where you're located at the time, when you might be having conversations with Aboriginal people. A lot of times Aboriginal people will correct you and tell you how they want to be referred to. It is actually also perfectly fine for you to ask, and Aboriginal people don't have any problem with that. They're happy to be asked because then you get it right from the start, and then that's cleared up, and the interaction can continue. There's no awkwardness about it. In academic, so I went on later, which we'll talk about through the podcast, but went on later to do some more academic work and another degree in the specific area of Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous was used more in academic circles, that's for sure. But that's the word I use now, and like I said, I do refer back to the word Aboriginal because that was that kind of time and place, and it is acceptable. It's not unacceptable, but in academic circles it wasn't as acceptable, and so Indigenous. But as I finished up my degree, because I was only doing it part-time, so I went over a period of time, there had been this morph into First Nations. I find that a bit uncomfortable. Some Aboriginal people I have heard from say that they're not really comfortable with that. They don't feel like that reflects them and their lived history, and it can also be identified as a reference that comes from other countries in the way that they refer to their own and to themselves in their own Indigenous circumstance, like in Canada, for example, and the United States and New Zealand. So it's all different, but really what I've learned is as you enter into these interactions or these spaces, small towns, you just ask.
Which is a respectful way to do it.
Anyway. Exactly. Yeah.
It makes sense as well.
Yeah, but the one big no is to use the word Aborigines. It's just not acceptable at any level anymore. Yeah.
Let's circle back to, you said you went to university to study a degree.
Yes.
So what did you study exactly? What was the name of the degree? And
I think I sat on for years all these things, these lived experiences I'd had in that small country town, and as I learnt more as an adult, I started to think what was really going on there and what is really going on in Australia. It never sat well with me, this big difference in equality. And I didn't really have a clear understanding of racism, but I knew that something wasn't right. And my husband and I have had successful private businesses. I was working in areas that were so far removed from any of that, but it was just thoughts that I had. And then I decided I would act on them and learn something more. And they're a university not far from me in northern New South Wales. I did a lot of research on what universities offered as far as something for a non-Indigenous person that would be meaningful for them to do. And this university has a very strong school of Indigenous knowledge. So they have their business school, their education school, and their Indigenous knowledge school.
Okay. Were there many, when you did your research, were there many universities offering?
They were doing all sorts of different things. Some universities were focusing mostly on language, maybe universities in the Northern Territory or universities in Western Australia. Actually, I think there was one in Adelaide as well. Their focus was a lot about language, Indigenous language, which really was because back then there was a real push to preserve language, and that is still a very strong issue. Some of it too is around policy, so policy, government type, leading people into government type policy setting roles. But the one that I did kind of covered a lot. It covered lots of. I could have gone into two sort of there were two major streams. There was health. The health covered a lot of trauma. They've actually changed the name of it now. It is a trauma and healing major. I didn't have the fortitude for the trauma. I knew that in myself because the trauma is terrible, and I didn't think it was my place to go there. So the things that I was interested in was community development, really, because it's positive. There were lots of things happening in that space. I had a little side interest going on with Indigenous art, and I had begun collecting Indigenous art over the years from all sorts of communities and places. And so, I liked, and I could see that Indigenous art, I was developing a real interest in remote art centres, and I could see that as a really positive community development type initiative that interested me. So I did that side of the degree. So it was about community development. There were units on Australian history because that's important to where we're at today. There were units on health. There were units on mental health, racism, and tourism. So that really appealed to me. And then within that, I did a field study unit with the University of Queensland. It was actually an art history unit, and it was run by a very clever lady called Sally Butler, and her specialisation was Indigenous art, and she ran this field trip that took us into amazing spaces and great opportunities, and that was really enjoyable.
How long did the degree go for?
Well, 3 years.
Because you did part-time, you said?
But I did do it part-time, and I think in the end I knocked it over in about 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, and I loved every minute of it. I loved the research part of it. I loved expanding my mind and learning something new about things that I had known about but never really knew. I loved learning about the history. That was really interesting, and all that in Australia, you might have heard the conversation about how history is taught in schools today, and it's just whitewashed, and that's changing now. But Australia, it wasn't a peaceful settlement, and there were wars, and a lot of terrible government policy affected people in a lot of terrible ways, and it was really interesting to learn about all of that.
Do you know if the curriculum you had for your degree was created in collaboration with Indigenous people?
Oh, it was written by Indigenous people.
Okay.
That was the great thing about Southern Cross University and the Indigenous Knowledge Unit is that they had a board of elders that came from that community. They sanctioned everything. They were tough. It really had to be, all the protocols had to be followed, had to be respectful. The unit itself, was underwritten with all these set protocols that had to be followed. All the staff were Indigenous. They weren't the elders. A lot of the staff came from other places, and they had to be vetted by the board because they were on their country.
Okay.
And the elders had to be comfortable that those visiting lecturers were appropriate to what their goals were. It was very complex.
When did that first arrive? I'm just curious because you just said about being on the land. There's that phrasing people say when they first, whether it's a conference. I know that it happened at my university where people pay tribute to the land we're on when introducing any kind of topic. When did that first happen, and who investigated that?
I think where that comes from is it's a respect thing, and it is a protocol. It's actually a protocol in Indigenous communities that when you enter them, you find the local elder and you introduce yourself and you tell them what your business is and are you welcome on their country.
So you have to get approval, if I may say, before you actually can say it.
That's the underlining meaning of, to the best of my understanding and the way that it's been told to me, is that that's where that comes from. And I've seen my lecturers do it because we did some field trips and things around the Northern Rivers because there's a really interesting Indigenous histories around there. Lots of very special places that we were given access to because we were taken there by an elder. And I've seen my lecturers do it. They will go and make the introduction. All the right protocols are followed. They stay quite separate while they do that, so I'm not privy to what the conversations are. And then you go forward from there.
Okay. I was just always curious about how, and do people just say it because it's now, part of the rules or,
No. There is that reason behind it. Okay. Yeah. And I get disappointed that there's all this conversation now around how it's not appropriate.
Okay.
Because I don't think it's not asking too much of anybody, and if you know 5 minutes about Indigenous knowledge these days, that most people should. It's Australia's a big country. It was split up into 250 nations. That's easy knowledge now. They were all different language groups. They did that as they crossed over into each other's language groups. It's not that tricky to spend 2 minutes before an important ceremony or an official event or even, a training exercise within your own company. However it's important to you to do that. Yeah. Because you're actually asking for permission to enter. So it's just a respectful thing. All communities, Aboriginal communities, have their own particular spin on it. Even these days I see sometimes they're getting young people to do it. Traditionally, it was the elders that did it, but the elders are obviously all right now with young people conducting the Welcome to Country. It's no biggie. It doesn't hurt. It's respectful and it has deep meaning. Yeah. It's not just a good idea somebody had. Yeah. It actually has good meaning.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier how you've went on a few field trips, and I also happen to know you stayed a few times within communities. Can you tell us more about those experiences? It's if you want to talk about the most recent one.
The most recent one was when I finished my degree and really wanted to get some practical experience in a community. So my Indigenous art background led me to a community that I'd heard about. And the community is called Maningrida in East Arnhem Land. It's very remote, and inside that very remote community is this amazing organisation called Bopera Women's Centre, and I had heard about them, and they are artists, and their specialty is screen printing fabric, and they have been doing that now for probably, I think maybe 10 years. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, the screen printing was probably happening a long time before that, but it became more formalised in a remote area art centre. That's what they call them, remote area art centres, and that was one. So I approached them. I approached the art centre manager. Often in those remote area art centres, they are non-Indigenous people running them. There's a lot of work around training up Indigenous art centre managers, but it's not always easy because they are remote, and non-Indigenous prospects would find it difficult to find the skills within their own communities to run the art centres because they run them as businesses. Okay. A lot of them now are financially viable. They receive very little government funding anymore because the money they make from their art centres is significant. And they house significant Aboriginal artists who have amazing profiles. In some of the most amazing Aboriginal artists in Australia today come from shanty towns in the middle of the desert, north of Adelaide, like incredible places where they produce this amazing art. And that's not to take away from all the, there are a lot of very well-regarded Indigenous urban artists as well doing their thing around photography and other formats, but my interest has always been in remote art centres. So I went there, I talked to the art centre manager. She was lovely. The issue in that community was housing and if they had somewhere for me to stay, because housing is limited. It was a bigger community. I think it was about 6,000 people. There were 2 strong language groups in that community that lived quite separately, and even that little community had like a little town centre and then various camps around the edges of them that separated the language groups. Because the language groups can be quite feisty when they're together. Yeah. Opinionated. Maybe aggressive.
Ah, ok, agressif, ok.
Yeah.
What's the word?
Feisty.
Feisty.
Okay. I learned a new
On
vocabulary.
every episode we learn a new word. It's an English lesson. Yeah.
So it was a women's only group. So in that town was also a very successful art centre, Maningrida Art Centre, very successful. A lot of their art was works done on bark, works done with pandanus leaf weaving, pandanus leaf dyeing, pandanus leaf, and timber products, carvings. And not so much painting, but they would have done some painting, but that wasn't their main areas of expertise. In those art centres, anyone can bring their art in. Every art centre I've had contact with, it's a community facility and anyone can bring their art in, whether it's amazing art or not so amazing art, which is what is great about it. So for some of those communities, doing their artwork is all they have to do in their day. If it's collecting pandanus leaves and weaving a basket, that might be the only thing they've had to do all day, and some of them will really embrace even being able to do that simple exercise. So Bopera Women's Centre sits in the town with that. So they have pretty good profile because they're both significant in their own right. And so all those women in that, so the art centre manager oversees everything. There's usually an assistant running around. That became me for that period of time that I was there. I was the assistant. And then the women will learn, while I was there, they're actually learning to make the screens, which is really tricky because you have to do special things with the original design and then do things with photographs to put it onto the screen, and it's complex. So often they would send their screens away and get them back done. Okay. But they were also learning how to do their own screens. And then big long tables set up, really professionally set up, big long tables, long lengths of fabric. They certainly weren't weaving the fabric, they were buying that in, long lengths of fabric, and then they would screen them. And sometimes with multiple runs over a screen, like move the screen to the next section, do a run, wait till that whole fabric was dry, get a fresh screen that was a part of the whole image, lay that screen, run over that. So you're building on the image. Okay. And sometimes that would happen up to 3 or 4 times on one. So it's very technical and time consuming and lots of tiny parts to the process. It takes a long time to do it. So these amazing women were doing amazing things with all this fabric that was taking weeks and months to produce. Wow. And then selling it online. And they had an amazing following. It was incredible. So I just filled up their paint pots. I was their runner. I would do anything they wanted me to do. I loved every minute of it. I was just there to do. In the mornings, the other part of my job, they had a troop carrier, a Land Cruiser troop carrier, and I had a route I had to follow. Mm-hmm. One of the ladies would come with me because it was so hard to know how to get around the community. It was like one end, to the other and then over this way, all called something different, all picking up women on any given day. New people would come. Yeah. So I would drive the troopy around with one of the women in my ear telling me which way to turn.
Second on your left.
I would collect everybody up. You park out the front. There was a protocol around it. You weren't allowed to enter. I wasn't allowed to get out of the car because not everybody in the community knew me and knew who I was, so I wasn't to get out of the car. Not that I was in danger. It was just a respectful thing. Mm-hmm. I wasn't to get out of the car. We would honk 2 times and the lady would be waiting in her house and she would come out, kids had come out going, your lift's here, you know. They'd run back inside. The lady would come out, she'd get in, we'd drive to the next house. The whole process took about an hour and a half. It took forever because you'd have to have chats, you'd have to drop kids off at school, you'd have to, you know, drive circles around the water buffalo that was roaming in the street. We'd have to stop at the shop, buy snacks. We'd have to, yeah, it was very funny. And then in the afternoon, we have to do it all in reverse.
Yeah, so that's too bad. If you do it one way, you have to do it the other way.
Yeah, look, to be honest, it was the best part of my day. Every day I loved it. I loved doing it. And bit by bit they got more used to me and I could pick up more of what they were saying and join in a little bit more. It was so good. I loved it.
How long were you there for?
6 weeks. So I lived with another white lady who worked for the little cooperative, like an administrative management cooperative. I lived with her and she had a nice house. I say that in inverted commas. She had a nice house, a nice brick house, air conditioned. I had my own room and it faced the water, which in our Western mind, that's very lovely location.
Yeah.
But the house did have 3 high fences around it because the crocodiles came up the beach. So the fences were there.
Welcome to Australia.
Welcome, yes, welcome to Arnhem Land. And I did see crocodiles while I was there. I did go for walks along the beach. It wasn't very long, but it was nice just to go down and be by the water. Some mornings I would go down and you could see the crocodile prints where it had come up, or croc had come up the water and gone back in. Often they would come up to the sand and grab the camp dogs and take those and take them back in, for food. The kids were very comfortable swimming in the water. I mean, they obviously knew way more than me about the water and how to identify what was going on in the water, but the kids did swim.
Wow.
They didn't swim like we would think of swimming at the beach, but they would often just be waist deep in the water fishing.
Still,
rather than
yeah.
Swimming. Yeah, but
Wow.
they were there.
It's mad.
So yes, the 3 fences. She was lovely to me, that lady. She eventually left the community, as most non-Aboriginal people do when, you know, it's hard living. It's not easy. White people aren't always welcome into the communities because, you know, white people have taken so much and
There's still the whole history.
Indigenous
around
people are wary of that. White people aren't always even necessarily respectful of where they are in that time and place. So it's very complex. So I did that. I packaged up the fabrics. I was sending them to London. I was sending them to New York.
Oh, so
I
they're
was sending them.
internationally
Yeah.
known,
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah, actually that community, that Boppara Women's Centre has just finished up doing an amazing exhibition in India they have gone over there and learnt how to do the block printing where you carve the block of wood and make a stamp essentially. And they have been taught that by the Indian experts, and they have been over there printing fabric with the blocks with their own designs on them, with the Indigenous designs from that community on them, their own community. And then they've hung the fabrics and done this incredible exhibition.
Wow.
They've been to Paris. They went to Paris. A group of ladies and the art centre manager did an incredible exhibition in Paris.
Nice.
They're all
That's
there
so
in their
cool.
traditional clothes, like so beautiful in Paris. So it must have blown their mind.
Yeah.
It took them like 4 days or something to get there because they have to fly from their little community, have to get to Darwin, and then they have to get from Darwin to a more major capital city, and then they have to do the hop. It's such an effort to do anything into and out of those communities. And it gets cut off by the monsoon rains every year, so they get stuck. They can't even get to Darwin.
Yes.
Wow. How far is it from Darwin?
It was a 2-hour flight on a small plane. Most incredible landscape I've ever seen flying, because they don't fly high. It was amazing, that flight. All the waterways, and it's called Stone Country up there. So even though there's strong affiliations with some of the groups with the water, there's also a strong affiliation with this area called Stone Country, and you fly over that. It's amazing. Amazing natural naturally beautiful area, and it takes about 2 hours in the plane. I think it's about 600 kilometres, 600 or 700 kilometres. So it's a long way on dirt roads and flooded streams and all the rest of it, crocodiles and everything else.
Did you just have to watch when they were doing the painting or any kind of art, or?
No, in the end, I was shown how to do it, but it takes a lot of strength, and because you really have to reach, and you have to reach right across, and then use this particular technique where you pull the blade back towards you, and you have to use a certain amount of pressure. If you use too much pressure, the paint just squishes outside the screen, and when you pull the screen off, you've got all this sort of bleeding around the edge. And if you don't do it with enough pressure, when you take the screen away, it's patchy, like the paint hasn't got through properly to the fabric.
Okay.
So it's very precise. It's not easy. They work really hard when they're doing it. It's very physical.
Wow, okay. When was there, because I know it's a big interest of yours and it would deserve an own episode on its own to talk about the art. When did it start becoming, famous and big, the whole Indigenous art in itself? Or was it always something, because for example, you said, that community, they, went to Paris, you were sending art to the US or all around the world. When did it start really becoming, famous or recognised for?
There's been for a long time a lot of things happening in the Indigenous art space. My interest being more remote area art centre art production has led me to learn more about that. So that you can get caught up in the remote area art centre side of things because it's a rabbit hole in itself, but you can't ever discount what was going on in Australia with the urban artists, because they were doing things too, particularly around the 60s, the 50s and 60s, as a part of activism, as a part of creating profiles and having a voice. If you look at a lot of the artwork now, and that's developed over the years too, and if you look at a lot of the artwork now by urban artists, it comes from an activism kind of place, questioning colonisation, and people like Tony Albert, he collected things. He's famous all over the world now. Young Aboriginal guy, started collecting memorabilia type pieces, like touristy type kitsch pieces from op shops and things where Aboriginal people were depicted. So plates with like the native savage, I'm saying that in inverted commas again, because that was kind of where Australia was at that time. Aboriginal people were seen to be something to be looked at from a distance and have been of mild interest to people. So, they would produce a series of trinkets that defined that. So, the native savage standing there with his spear, with his little loincloth on in a statue or on a plate or on an ashtray or, a man's pipe or something with images carved on them. Like, he collects it. And he puts it all together and creates these amazing exhibitions. Oh, that's his thing. And it's all about colonisation. That's his dig at, this is what you did to us. This is how you represented us. This is you. This is about you, not about us. Yeah.
Wow, okay.
But my interest has been remote art centres, and that movement, it was a movement, it's referred to as a movement, happened in the 1970s really. So Aboriginal people were definitely in the bush living life with their culture, and a part of their culture is around dance, language, kinship, law, and all of that can be represented in the form of artwork, which then was paintings on rocks, gravings on rocks, which we call petroglyphs, paintings on timber, weaving, like I saw in Maningrida, because that gave them things to carry the babies in and things to collect the food, and that now is morphed into like saleable items of interest. So in the 1970s, a school teacher called Jeffrey Barden went to Papunya to teach. It's a mission town. A lot of them still were run by missionaries back then. A lot of the remote communities have a missionary base. A lot of remote communities are very strong Christians. So they have their traditional Aboriginal beliefs that come from their mob, their tribal space, and then they also have a Christian base because it was mostly Lutherans and some Protestants were going out, and the government was happy for them to go out there because they created what they called outstations. So they gave them some water, usually not any power, built them some humpies with some corrugated iron, and that was they were moved to there. They came in from the desert, moved to there. That they were their homes, and they were run by the missionaries.
Okay.
The kids were taken to school. They were dressed in Western clothes because they'd been removed from their traditional way of living. They were given flour and tea and grog, essentially. So this particular community was like that. Nobody was working. There was disease and poverty in the communities. He went there and could see how devoid this community was of any goodwill or happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, what can we do? Like, this is just terrible. These people deserve better than this. What can I do to revitalise or give this community a sense of purpose? They weren't grandiose ideas, I don't think. He was just trying to do the little bit that he could, and he encouraged the men to paint, and all they had to paint on was masonite board. So they had their traditional paints made from ochre and other barks and things, and he encouraged them to paint. And there's a very famous painting now called the Honey Ant Dreaming. It's their totem from that community was the honey ant, and they painted it on the school wall, and that was a part of the start of it. Then the masonite boards were gathered up and they were taken. This is a very simple retelling of the story, but the boards were taken to the local service station. Travellers were passing by, they were buying them, they were buying more of them.
Wow.
They had to do something more than just the masonite because they were running out of all the board. And then it's developed now into usually Belgian linen, stretched over canvas is the finished product.
Yeah.
But now communities are doing all sorts of things, not just the painting, but it really began there, the Western Desert. They call it the Western Desert Art Movement, and Papunya is still there. There is still an art centre there. There's lots of art centres around there now doing all sorts of different things.
Is it an art centre that gets tourism attracted because of that?
It's tricky.
It's still too...
It's tricky. So some of the art centres are tricky to get to and get cut off in the rain. So that's the first problem. They're on dirt roads, which not everybody has the vehicle that can navigate those sort of unkept dirt roads. Mm-hmm. You're usually driving into the desert somewhere. So for travellers, tourists, that's... Not everybody's comfortable doing that, nor should they if they're not comfortable. And then the art centres aren't always open. Sorry business, when sorry business happens, the whole town shuts down. Nobody's allowed to work. A lot of people leave the town for sorry business in other places, so there's nobody to run the art centre. So it can be complicated.
Yeah.
Okay.
I went with my mom in Darwin. There is one shop we wanted to go for the art. And when we arrived, it was closed when on the Google was open, and there was a phone number I have to call. So I tried to call. They say, okay, we are like 30 minutes something drive. They say, if you are happy to wait, we're coming. So we're feeling a little bit like we have to.
They just came for you.
Yeah, they came for us to open us. So after we were like in the show, it was beautiful, but we're feeling like we have to take something now because they moved to us, they opened for us. It was a little bit. Feeling a little bit strange to have to call for the shop, but yeah, definitely. It was not. It was very close of Darwin. It was not like what you say is that in the middle of a desert or nowhere. But
So that's common, where they would just be close and kind of situation, for example. Do you know?
it was the first time, so I don't know if he's comment. Or...
Yes, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I've not found that before, but that wouldn't surprise me because maybe they had more important business to do that day.
I don't know.
And I would just think that was incredible that they would go to the effort to get in their car and drive all the way in. And I'm glad you waited for them because they went to big effort to get in for you, and they probably would have liked something to be bought, but they probably wouldn't have minded either if you didn't. They would have been happy probably for you to see what they can do.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, that fits with the art centre, with the remote art centres, because sometimes they just can't be there. Some communities don't like people just arriving. Most of them really, in my experience, don't like people just arriving because it's confronting for people to see the communities. The community themselves know that. They know that it's confronting and they don't want to be judged because of the way they live. In saying that, most art centres will be happy for you to come if you ring ahead and say, we'd like to come out tomorrow. Anything can happen with that arrangement because business then could happen that afternoon and everybody gets called away. Hopefully you get a phone call to say, don't come. You might not.
Yeah.
I just see that as all a part of the adventure. It's just a part of the experience because that's just life.
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
because it happens for
it's
any
just
kind
life.
of businesses anyway. We usually like to finish every episode with like some advice or tips, but for you, we're thinking Ale had the great idea that maybe you'd have some recommendation of people who may be interested to broaden their Indigenous knowledge. Any artist, any type of wide content, anything you can think of that could people may be interested in to, read about, listen to, watch, anything, or do, or...
I had a funny feeling this question was coming when I left home this morning, and I was thinking, what if they, what am I going to tell them, which ones, because there's so many, I have so many.
Or maybe one that you have a deep interest in, that, it doesn't have to
from
be...
the art perspective or from like a cultural perspective? It's a can of worms because there's so much now available to people to broaden their knowledge. An interesting one at the moment is Bruce Pascoe with his Dark Emu story, where he challenges the idea that all Indigenous people were hunter and gather nomads, and he has evidence to support. He's a very clever academic too. Okay. He has evidence to support that Indigenous people did farm on country. That's interesting, but that's just like one small thing about agriculture. What I could do is send you a list.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah, and I could put on that things that relate to Indigenous knowledge for more general reading, and things that relate to art, and also I could send you links to art centres that I've been to that I know will accept travellers to them to look at the art. Yeah. I can share that with you.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Yeah.
The other difficulty in that is the spellings are difficult, so I can say them, but they will be spelt in a very different way. And you would never find them.
Especially us.
Specifically me.
Well, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Do you have any last questions?
No, it was this for the tips, but good. Amazing.
Thank you. We're definitely going to have you more for more episodes.
I'd love to. Yes, I'd love to. The other one I've just thought of is... this is good for people, maybe within your community, people who are travelling and seeing more of Australia. It's by a lady called Marcia Langton, who's a very clever academic, and she has written a tourist book, a tourist travel book called Loving Country.
Okay.
And that's very accessible from bookshops. It's very readable, and she breaks it down into regions and then tells you what Indigenous-based tourism businesses or experiences and national parks are in that region that you can go to.
Okay,
Oh,
that sounds
amazing. This is
good.
good, yeah.
Christmas present sorted.
Oh, yeah, that is good.
Mm.
Okay, well, thank you for coming in. It
Thank
was
you.
so interesting.
Yeah.
We were so happy to
Pleasure.
hear from all about your knowledge and experience. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having me. It was fun.
Until the next time.
Until the next
Until the
time.
next time.
Not early like that, huh? Please.
I was struggling. Thank you guys for
Thank-
listening, and we'll see you at the next episode.
Ciao, ciao.